He was the golden face of American cinema, charming, principled, untouchable. But as the sun set on Robert Redford's remarkable life, the silence around him grew deafening. No farewell tour. No dramatic final role. Just an eerie disappearance from the spotlight, as if he were already fading into memory. And then, the headlines hit. But the truth? The truth was far darker than anyone imagined. In his final days, Redford was a man haunted, not by failure, but by the ghosts of those he lost, and the crushing weight of what he couldn't save. What really happened in those final weeks? And why did those closest to him remain so eerily silent? In the final years of his life, Robert Redford seemed to slowly vanish. There were no farewell interviews, no standing ovations, no carefully curated goodbye tour. He didn't want it. He didn't need it. He just drifted away. And to those who had followed him for decades. Through the raw charisma of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, through the thunderous silence of Jeremiah Johnson, through the quiet brilliance of All Is Lost, it was hard to grasp how a man who once lit up every screen in the world could disappear so quietly, like a candle blown out in the wind. By the time Redford officially announced his retirement from acting in 2018, he was already receding from public view. He said it gently, as if letting go of something sacred, "It's time to hang it up." But the truth is, he had been preparing to leave far earlier. Not just the spotlight, but the world. Those closest to him noticed the change. He stopped taking calls. Turned down awards. Missed events he once would have moved mountains to attend. It wasn't bitterness. It was something deeper. Something heavier. For years, Redford had been a man who carried grief like a second skin. The death of his mother in his youth. The loss of his infant son. The passing of his closest friends. Paul Newman, Sidney Pollack, and eventually, his adult son James, who died from liver cancer in 2020. That one changed him completely. People saw it in his eyes. That once fierce spark dimmed into something quieter, something broken. He still smiled for the cameras when he had to, but it no longer reached his soul. The grief was too loud to ignore. In those last years, Redford retreated to his ranch in Utah, a place he once called his sacred ground. Surrounded by mountains and silence, he walked the forests alone. He fed the horses. Sat for hours on the porch. And in those still, private moments, he finally allowed the weight of a lifetime to settle into his bones. He had always been a man in motion, activist, director, actor, father, lover, builder. But toward the end, motion gave way to reflection. And reflection, eventually gave way to silence. The people who tried to reach him say the same thing: he wasn't angry. He wasn't depressed. He just didn't want to talk anymore. It was as if the world had become too loud, and he had finally earned the right to step away from it. Not with fanfare. Not with drama. But with quiet. He had already said everything he needed to say, in his films, in his activism, in his legacy. He had helped change how independent cinema worked. He had shaped how environmental causes were championed. He had rewritten what it meant to be a leading man, strong, yes, but also gentle, haunted, and real. And now, all that was left was the quiet, and the ghosts. Those ghosts followed him. Not literally. But emotionally. The friends he buried, the roles he turned down, the loves he never rekindled. All of them lived with him in those final seasons. And when people saw him out, rarely, briefly, they said he looked peaceful. Tired. A man no longer fighting the current. And that's what makes his final days so haunting. Not because they were dramatic. But because they weren't. He didn't rage against the dying of the light. He let it come, slowly, like dusk after a long summer day. One that had been beautiful, powerful, complicated, and exhausting. This wasn't the ending fans had imagined. There was no grand final role. No send-off speech. Just silence. And within that silence was a truth far more shocking than any tabloid could print. Robert Redford didn't want the spotlight anymore, because he had already said goodbye. Robert Redford lived through war, through fame, through heartbreak and reinvention. But nothing, not even the trauma of losing a child in infancy, compared to what happened in 2020. That was the year James Redford, his adult son, his creative partner, his mirror, died after a long and silent battle with liver cancer. And when James passed, something in Robert collapsed. Quietly. Permanently. James wasn't just a son. He was a survivor. Born with a rare liver disease, he underwent 2 transplants before he was 30. But he didn't become bitter. He became a warrior, not with fists, but with films. James was a documentary filmmaker, one who turned his pain into purpose. He spoke up for the environment, for mental health, for organ donation. He didn't ride on his father's fame. He carved his own path with humility, and in doing so, earned Robert's deepest respect. He was better than me, Redford once said. More decent. More patient. More present. For years, the two worked side by side, quietly building films and advocacy projects. James was the quiet force behind many of Redford's late-life philanthropic efforts. Where Robert raged against injustice, James reasoned with it. Where Redford's youth was fueled by rebellion, James's was shaped by gratitude, just to be alive another day. Their bond wasn't loud. There was Paul Newman, of course. More than a co-star. More than a friend. Newman was his counterpart, his brother in arms, the man who stood with him not only in film but in life. Their bond, built over decades and 2 legendary films, was a rare thing in Hollywood, unbreakable. They never competed. They never betrayed. They simply understood each other in a way that didn't require constant affirmation. When Paul died in 2008, Redford didn't say much. But those who knew him said he was never the same. The light in his eyes dimmed. He became quieter. More thoughtful. As if a piece of himself had gone missing. Then there was Sidney Pollack, the director who saw into Redford's soul and helped shape his most vulnerable performances. Jeremiah Johnson, 3 Days of the Condor, Out of Africa, all were born from the trust between 2 men who respected the power of silence and subtlety. When Sidney passed, Redford said it felt like losing a limb. You keep reaching for something that's not there anymore. That ache never went away. He spoke to Sidney in his head, even years after the funeral. He wondered what Sidney would have thought of his final performances, and whether he had lived up to the man's belief in him. But it wasn't just death that filled Redford with quiet regret. It was time. The kind you can't get back. He had lived a life of purpose, yes. But also a life of distance. He admitted in later interviews that he often chose work over connection. That in building a legacy, he sometimes forgot to check in on the people who helped him build it. There were collaborators he never called again. Family members he drifted from. Relationships that faded not because of anger, but because he thought he had more time. And then, of course, there was Marlon Brando, the unreachable icon, the actor who inspired him to chase truth on screen but who remained a stranger in life. Redford often spoke of Brando with reverence, but also regret. They never really connected, never really tried. And when Brando died, Redford was left with a deep, unresolved silence. It wasn't mourning the man. It was mourning the moment that never came. The friendship that never formed. The understanding that never took root. In his final years, those silences grew louder. He would walk through his Utah property and see places where old friends once stood, Paul leaning against a fence, Sidney laughing over a script, James filming quietly in the corner. But now, those spots were empty. He kept photos. Not on the walls, but in drawers. He would take them out sometimes, not to display, but to remember, in private, what once was. When people asked him about his biggest regret, he never spoke in specifics. He wasn't one for confessionals. But his eyes would tell the truth. He missed them. All of them. And in that missing, he carried a guilt that never fully left his shoulders. That's the part the headlines missed, the reality that even legends feel loneliness. That even the most admired man in the room can sit alone with a cup of coffee and wonder if he should have made one more call. Said one more thank you. Told one more person they mattered. By the end, Robert Redford wasn't chasing new projects or appearances. He was chasing peace. Trying to reconcile with the past before the curtain fell. And though he did not speak loudly about the men he missed, he carried them with him, in every silent step, every long stare, every sunset that reminded him of days that would never return. Because some grief doesn't vanish. It just becomes part of the way a man breathes.